Hello, this is the podcast from the international research platform SIMM, with reports and interviews from across the world on the role music can play in social and community programs. I am Lucas Perron. During this 7th episode of the SIMM-podcast, you will hear me interview Maria Maino from Italy and Gillian Howell from Australia. I discuss with them about research on social and community music projects in the Global South, research developed by local scholars as well as by researchers from the North. Maria Maino is co-founder of the research platform SIMM. Besides being actively involved in Sistema Italia, she is vice president of Sistema Europe and, as such, in regular contact with many practitioners of the Sistema-inspired projects in different countries in the northern as well as in the southern hemisphere. On the 9th of March, Maria Maino will chair the last session of the 5th symposium. Maria, you will be chairing the last session of the symposium, the ongoing symposium in March, and we are interesting ourselves in what's happening in terms of practice in the Global South, in the field of social music projects and community music projects, but also, of course, because it's about SIMM, the SIMM platform, we're interested in research in this field. And besides the fact that you will be yourself chairing this session, I'm very interested in your personal experience as being vice president of the European Sistema-inspired projects. And were you yourself in Venezuela?
No, I was meant to go, and at that time then there was the great unrest started, and all the activities were cancelled. And then little by little Venezuela started coming back, and it's really surprising. People are going there, colleagues are going, and are reporting back that it's astonishing how much is going on in spite of the restrictions of the pandemic and of the economic crisis. So it seems like music is sort of irreducible. And so I actually was in contact with Venezuela yesterday. Also, last week we had the Sistema USA Symposium and Seminario online with hundreds of participants from all over the world, including our Venezuelan colleagues. And actually they were very prompt in cooperating about what is going on for research for them. And they have several positions of researchers in the structure of the Foundation for El Sistema in Venezuela, and are in contact with a lot of projects. So it's still quite live, and I think they are also very interested in developing their evidence-based approach.
The Sistema-inspired projects in so many different countries in the world, as they name themselves as a group, are very much inspired by this project in Venezuela, but are very often quite different because developed in very different circumstances, in very different cultural surroundings and traditions. Can you say something about this?
Indeed, because it's a great melting pot, Venezuela, and also the fact that they are almost 50 years old meant that they have still stratified their tradition with the current tendencies. So I think it's also a particularly fortunate way for the youngsters to access repertoire that they feel closer to. And so there is the popular music, their own indigenous music, there is Western music. Also, one of our panelists will be talking about how there is a yearning to get acquainted with Western repertoire and to have a competent access to it. So I think there is really a development towards openness. Also in other South American countries that are very motivated. I was speaking with colleagues from the network that's called the Global Leaders that has been existing to you. I don't know if you know about this network. It is geared already for 10 years towards training professional musicians and managers in developing awareness of the contribution of art, and in particular music, to social equality and inclusion and development. And it is a very modern approach because, as the name says, the global leaders are spread all over. And they have what they call the cohorts, one year after the other. And it's extremely interesting, including, of course, the ones from the Global South. So actually, I thought that it would be a wonderful idea to inform them also about your initiative and about the next two podcasts. So, and also the next two seminarios in the SIMM series. So I think it's a really very rich moment because in spite of the pandemic, we all have time to think and to really reflect on how we want to go forward. And of course, research is one of the things that being halted in the field, or at least slowed down. But in terms of production of research, I keep hearing from a lot of researchers how they have been able to do more rather than less.
I'm particularly interested in how you think that people from our up north can learn from people from the global south. And of course, what is clear, we already mentioned this, is that clearly practitioners have been inspired by what's going on in Venezuela and in other countries in Latin America in this field. But have you also been in touch with people doing research in this field, which from the north have been doing research in these countries in Latin America or elsewhere? Or the other way around, people from Latin America coming to Europe and being involved in doing research on social music projects in European countries?
Well, actually, yes. I am in contact with a colleague in Chile who has spent a lot of time in Italy, and closely collaborating with a pilot project which has become a really steering force in the field of kindergarten, which is in Reggio Emilia, and it's the Malaguzzi Center. And this colleague from Chile, who is now back in Chile, is still keeping the contacts and developing a dialogue with the other hemisphere, for instance. So this is actually very recent. So I will be very happy to report on it at the moment of our last session. But indeed, there is movement with Colombia. I mean, there are also musicians, of course, traveling between both continents. And the social awareness of teaching artists is one of the forces of ambassadors who bring new approaches to music and to the social impact of music, the involvement of teaching artists. And I think we still have a lot to do about that. And I am very much looking forward to what I heard described in the previous episode, to this survey, this review of the SIMM projects all over, because this will be a wonderful tool for involving musicians from a closer perspective.
Yes, the comparative research between Colombia, UK, Finland and Belgium. That's the research you...
Well, did I misunderstand? I think that the incoming president mentioned also a survey of 60 projects.
Yes, that you just finished this book for the 75th anniversary of the UN. Yes,
exactly.
Indeed, yes. Yeah, this compendium.
Yeah, the compendium, exactly. I think that would be a really great stepping stone also for the general audiences to get closer and more familiar with the project.
Do you have some ideas of items that you want to discuss during your panel discussion in a few weeks?
Oh yes, very much so. There is actually two themes that are very much very close to my head and my heart. One is how orchestras and choirs can go beyond what is being reproached to them as authoritarian models of leadership top down, but they can get involved in this worldwide movement that's called the systemic leadership, where the empowerment of all participants is actually in the foreground. And I think it's time to get beyond this idea of conductors as dictators and choir masters as the ones who are the repository of the truth, and only they know how to do things and are in fact imposing it on the ensembles. But what we see, especially in numerically smaller ensembles, that it is quite feasible to have an embedded leadership where everybody feels a protagonist. And this is actually how we approach, even with children, our model of collective music education. So that is one aspect I'm very interested in.
I see my friend Marius at the other end of the studio laughing very much. He's a musician, so I think he appreciates very much what you just mentioned.
Oh, good. Well, no, I really feel strongly about that, because also knowing the personalities of conductors and how they have evolved in a really in an attitude of listening and in a peer esteem towards the musicians, and how even I think a great model of this was really Claudia Bado, who knew all the orchestra members by name, who could relate to each of them, who would stay during the orchestra breaks to discuss things with them. So it is a systemic leadership.
So it's not only possible in chamber music. It's even possible also in...
Oh, no, I really think that it's getting... I mean, we have an ensemble that's called Spira Mirabilis in Italy, who plays without conductor now. And it is possible. So, yes, it is actually a rib of the Abbado Mozart Orchestra that came into being, and is having wonderful results. So not only the Lucerne Orchestra, but also Spira Mirabilis are outposts of this approach.
So interesting.
And so that is one idea. Please.
Can we keep this in the podcast episode before your sessions?
Absolutely.
Because I'm sure many people will be curious about this part of the discussion.
Yes, definitely.
What else would you like to discuss?
The second subject is the connection between individual well-being and collective well-being. And, the other side of my activity is very much involved in the relation between music and neuroscience. And the more we get into this, the more we have to have an approach to the data that can be collected about basing this in evidence. And what worries me sometimes is that everybody who does research has to develop their own indicators, it seems. And this is something that we could do in the relation, as you call it, the global north and the global south, is to put some of this experience into a generally, universally accepted sort of database, or whatever it is, a collection of guidelines, where when a project is being devised, one does not have to start ex novo or ex abrupto devising one's own indicators of impact. In Italy in particular, now that there has been a reform of the so-called third sector, so the non-profit sector, there are even laws that specify what non-profit organizations have to go after in terms of measuring the social impact. So why should we all invent the umbrella, as we say?
Even though that's very difficult.
Indeed, but at least it is difficult to specify. But to have a public body at the level of law get involved in the technicalities of what qualifies social impact means that now all the levels are involved. And so...
Yes, that's also a bit worrisome, no?
I think that the guidelines are not worrisome. I think as long as people have the freedom to apply the guidelines to their own free context, I think it's healthy. It is not, how would I say, an armor of the official approach, but rather a large perspective that even the public body wants to support, and consider it that it is part of the activity, the measurement of the impact. So it is now accepted also within budgets that you have the monitoring and you have the measurement in terms of output and outcome, as always. And I think there should be more exchange, and I'm really grateful to SIMM that it fosters this kind of platform. In fact, when I was hesitating finding the name, in fact, it is another platform that we would need in order to have the best practice of data collection. And I think it would be a wonderful theme also for one of the conferences. I think the connection between research, evidence, and policy applied to the growth of well-being for the individual and for society needs more connections between the data pooling. And because so much research is of a qualitative nature, the uniformity is a search, is a constant challenge, and how we can try to speak the same language at times, at least to make faster progress. So I think this in relation to also the concern that we all have towards integrating the sustainable development goals is a must. We cannot really develop projects without that additional challenge. And culture is not an explicit goal, but embedded in so many of the goals, directly or indirectly. And so we have really started thinking that way. And in terms of the dialogue between North and South, if that's the way we want to put it, at least provisionally, it should provide a lot of inspiration.
Thank you so much, Maria. Gillian Howell is a scholar from Australia. She's involved in research on social music projects in Kosovo, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, and other places. With her, I could discuss about the position of outside scholars she and I are doing research in the Global South. Hello, Gillian.
Hello, Lucas.
I'm really happy I can talk with you because in many ways I think you and I were in similar positions, doing research coming from outside into places where we're not from. And so I would especially want to talk with you about that. So out-of-country research, you could call it. And what that represents as opportunities, looking from outside inside, and also from limits that it poses and maybe certain difficulties.
Yeah.
I don't know where to start, but you've been doing research in a series of places, Sri Lanka, Kosovo, Afghanistan lately, and maybe you can give some first ideas, impressions.
Well, one of the first impressions or ideas that comes to me when I think about being an outsider researcher is in terms of the advantages, if you like. I mean, I don't know that they're necessarily advantages, but there are always going to be qualities that are based on who you are and where you're coming into that are influenced by who you are and where you've come from and where you're coming into. And I suppose one of those is that people might, just as people might not, there might be things that they don't share with you because you're from outside. There also may be things that they do share with you because you are from outside the community. It can create a space in which words are found for things that might be otherwise difficult to talk about with people who are more entwined in the social setting. And I mean, you'd never know if that's what's happening, of course, because you receive the information that you receive. But sometimes as someone who knows a lot about the project that you're inquiring into, but isn't associated with it or isn't entwined with it in some way, then people might feel that they can share with you things that are quite detailed or critical, or just that produce information that if you were their colleague who they'd been working alongside all this time, they might not necessarily share with you.
Yes.
Especially, I guess, when I've been researching some of the projects I've been researching, there's because as soon as you're researching something, you start to know a lot about it. You read the background documents, you get a sense of the timeline, you know some of the different milestone events that may have shaped things in certain ways. And so the person who is talking with you, even though you were an outsider, they're speaking with someone who has quite a detailed knowledge of the subject matter. And that can create a freedom, I suppose, of where experiences are shared that they may not have expected to share in the conversation.
Yes. What can be helpful is also to work with local researchers to form teams, no? So what I did in Kinshasa, I worked with sociologists and political scientists who were always with me in most of the interviews I did. And I learned enormous amounts of information and understanding through them because they live there and they understand things that I wouldn't be able to understand and which were said but I couldn't hear. So this collaboration with people who are in the country and doing research together with people from outside of the country is very interesting. Do you have similar experiences?
Yeah, and one of the experience I had working with my interpreter in East Timor, it comes to mind because working with her, she's very interested in the subject matter, and she very much became like a cultural interpreter as well as an interpreter of words. We would have conversations after interviews where she could help contextualize some of what had been said in the interview, and was incredibly valuable collaborator in that way, taking on that kind of role.
Are you a musician, in fact?
Yeah, I trained as a clarinet player, and I still play in a number of bands here in Melbourne.
No, I'm laughing because I'm studying clarinet myself.
That's great.
So I'm not a clarinet player, but I'm studying
it
clarinet.
It can be a very unforgiving instrument, but it can be very beautiful. I hope you're past the unforgiving stage. Although I find it returns.
Yeah. Do you think it's important for us to, in this research, to be busy playing music ourselves?
To come to it as musicians? I hope that it's useful, and I hope that it informs it in a way. I can't say that that's my reason for playing music. I started by playing the music first, and so it's
of course
something that is just part of what I try to do as my sense of wholeness, if you like. I think actually that's a challenge for me, is to keep the music in the picture sometimes, because I'm always very interested in the wider socio-cultural, socio-political context. The political economies of these projects often are what preoccupy me. It's very easy for the music to fall into the background, and that's sort of one of the challenges I think that I set for myself in my research, to just try to keep the music in the picture. But I know that I don't always keep it in the picture. Sometimes the other questions become what I write about and what I think about.
But talking about challenges, but we know the challenges involved in mastering an instrument and a repertoire. We can also more easily understand the challenges that people participating in social music projects have in that sense.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things about being an outsider is that the people there, especially for you and I, where we're working in situations where there have been wars, there have been really, people have lived through extraordinary, challenging, difficult, dangerous times. But because we're talking about music, often music is one of the ways that they carve a space that gives them some distance from those experiences. That often for the people that I'm speaking with, that's something that they express. But I think for myself as a researcher, I try to keep that knowledge of distance between our experiences in daily life in my mind, and try to stay connected to what it might be to come to music after those experiences.
Another question I have is the question of how to share the findings with those who have participated in the research, and being from outside, how we succeed in sharing the information, the findings that and the observations that we made. This is not always an easy thing to do. I don't know whether it's more easy or more difficult for outside researchers coming from outside than from those who are from inside. That's not clear, but I do find it myself difficult. In my case, it has to do with language also very much, not only with the fact that I'm far away from Kinshasa, but my research, my writing is in English and not in French. And so, I'm finding solutions, but I'm very curious to hear what your experiences are in terms of sharing your findings.
It's been very challenging. And one of the challenges for me was just the time frame in which I was gathering data and making connections with people in Timor-Leste, for example, East Timor. It was a time when it was sort of pre-smartphone time there. So people weren't necessarily accessing the internet all that often. They didn't have social media profiles. They didn't have email addresses that they checked regularly. And so the easiest way to contact someone was to call them on their phone. And then phone numbers could change quite frequently as well. So, research is slow, and PhD research can be at the time frame between when you are meeting someone and interviewing them and they are contributing and helping you with the research. And then it actually being finished, a long time can pass. That's right.
Yeah.
And I think it's easier now. I've got a project that I've recently started, so it's only just getting underway with young people in Afghanistan, and that's being conducted entirely online. And so the connections that I have are all through platforms like Messenger and WhatsApp, and I feel more optimistic that I'll be able to stay connected to these people and therefore also be able to more effectively and in meaningful ways share what the findings are. And because I'll have that initial contact already established rather than the in-person meeting. So
I'm going to start a personal podcast on my research in French, because that's maybe, I see that as a possible opening way to share what I found and also discuss it with those who participated in it through a podcast, because this is indeed a very interesting channel to share information more easily than through writing articles or books.
I think so. I mean, it keeps it in conversation, and, so many cultures, conversations are one of the ways through which relationships are forged and that they evolve. Yarning in Indigenous Australian culture, for example, is, the way that stories are shared and information is shared and knowledge is produced and also disseminated. So certainly not in the written form. Yeah, and I think as well podcasts have that possibility of, we're talking about music and we could also share music, and so make those connections much more visceral, much more clear.
Reading your work, it's clear to me that you want to give a voice to those that you've been meeting, interviewing, studying. And so, in fact, in the podcast, you literally give a voice to them, because you will hear them speak and share their thoughts and experiences.
Yeah. I mean, actually, when I did my PhD research, I hadn't had the idea that I would be creating a website of some kind and so as part of the consent process, we discussed the possibility that these recordings of voices or short clips of the interview as video might be included on a website. But actually, that's not something I've continued to pursue. And I think it's also interesting that within the academy, and the different ways that dissemination happens and is valued within the academy can be different to how it's can be effectively disseminated in communities, and that's certainly not a new challenge. That's something that's been discussed a lot, but I think there is a tension that arises there, because the expectations of those two groups can be very different, or two communities can be quite different. I think it's something that I constantly grapple with, how to keep the relationships intact and honour the relationship that's been formed, and also write up the research and then share it and disseminate it and share it back with people and honour all of the voices in it. And it's something that I just feel like I can do better, that I'm learning all the time. And I feel like the projects that I'm working on now and developing now, I'm doing a better job at the outset, paying it, giving necessary attention to how this will work and how these connections need to be established at the start than perhaps I've done in the past. So, yeah,
And you're talking about your position as an out of the country researcher.
An outside researcher.
Yeah.
Looking into a situation that I can only look at from a distance, even if I'm there, because I'm not from there.
And developing then future research in closer collaboration with local researchers, isn't that a possible, maybe not solution is not the right word, but a way of enriching this part of your position of the outsider coming in? And I experienced it as a major part of my research, the discussions I had with my colleagues, my team members. Also the fact, that's why I mentioned it, that I was the only one making music, studying music, doing the research with a sociologist and with a political scientist who were making music, have this experience, was also very interesting in our discussions that we had in understanding what the difficulties could be for the young musicians in Kinshasa to master instrument, to master repertoire. And,
yes, I remember that about your project.
But of course, so that's maybe where they could learn something from me, but I learned a lot from them about how life is over there, and a lot of things that I couldn't see without them. I couldn't understand without these discussions I had with them. So that's really incredibly enriching, and that's also why I'm frustrated that I cannot put them more out front. And so I hope that this podcast on the Kinshasa research will also, of course, they will talk a lot in it, my colleagues, and in French.
Yeah. No, that's great. I mean, and another way that we can contribute is working with local researchers, but also building up the skills of people that we meet through the research who are interested in research, who become interested. I mean, an awful lot of research in countries that are the recipients of development aid or reconstruction aid, for example, is the research is often quantitative, and research means surveys. The idea that you can research something like a cultural aspect of your world that you inhabit, that's quite a new idea for a lot of the people that I've involved in my research. And for them, it can be really exciting. That, you mean I get to ask the questions? You mean I get to go and I could go and be the person who explores the sorts of questions that you're exploring, but in my own country. I've had some conversations in projects that I've just got underway recently with some of my interlocutors, and I can see this sort of, then think that would be great. Possibilities starting to enter their minds and take shape, and it's exciting if I can support them on that journey.
My university, the University of Ghent, where I did my PhD, they have a project which is really marvelous. It's called Silent Voices. And it's a Silent Voices workshop. You can find it on the internet. And it's a project which gives voice to researchers in the Global South and tries to find way to give them a voice and to be able to share their studies and their research and their needs for training and their needs for being in network with other people doing research on similar research questions and fields. Silent Voices. During this podcast episode, you heard interviews with Maria Maino from Italy and Gillian Howell from Australia. You can find more about them and about some of the projects they refer to in the little text which goes with this episode. The next episode of the SIMM-podcast will propose interviews with scholars from the Southern Hemisphere. Natalia Puerta Cordillo and Juan Rojas from Colombia, and also Tinashe Mutero from Zimbabwe, but who is doing research in South Africa. SIMM is the initiative of scholars and practitioners from 7 different countries and 4 different continents who felt the growing need to find ways to bring together people interested in developing research on the possible role music can play in social and community music programs. Sound engineer and co-editor of this episode of the SIMM-podcast is musician Mariusz Radwanski. Please visit our website at simplatform.eu.